Yeah, there it is. Yeah.
Yeah, there we go. Right, I just let somebody else in. Okay, so that was really, I was fascinated by what you were just saying there about the title of the book, and that
yes,
I'm just proofing my book at the moment, and yeah, the title is such a tricky issue, isn't it? But anyway,
yeah.
So we're going to carry on talking about neurotypes, because obviously that's the main thing that we're really interested in tonight.
Yeah.
So I wanted to just ask you, what were your reasons for writing?
Oh, yeah. Well, the first thing that I ever wrote about autism was an article in Wired magazine back in 2001 called The Geek Syndrome, which was an article about the prevalence of autism in high-tech communities. And at the time, there was a lot of nonsense going on in the news about vaccines. And there were also just a ton of rumors about, oh, it's, pollution is causing an autism epidemic, or the silicon in Silicon Valley is kind of like just a whole bunch of, stories. So for that article, what I did was I started to look at the genetics of autism, because it was already clear that the primary influence on whether or not someone is born as autistic is genetics. And it seemed to me that there was an uncanny correlation between certain skills in certain high-tech communities, and this doesn't apply to everyone. There are some autistic people who, have no interest in technology. They think it's rubbish. Although they might enjoy knitting or music, both of which have sort of pattern recognition activities involved. And so I wrote this article called The Geek Syndrome, and that was very much within what social, disability justice people call the medical model. I was a science reporter, I was a neurotypical, and I was looking at autism through what's called the medical model. However, I did see the very first seed of not just autistic culture, but neurodiversity was a website created by an autistic woman. I hope I'm not dead naming her somehow, but her name was Laura Tasanchik. And she did a website called the Institute for the Study of the Neurologically Typical. And it was a satire of kind of American Psychiatric Association websites about autism, except it was turning the lens of the medical model against the psychiatric establishment, really, and saying, like, neurotypicality is a terrible tragedy, and unfortunately there's no cure for it, and it's it's marked by compulsive sociability, inability to concentrate, and stuff like that. And it was so funny. And the thing about the humor in it was that even just the humor in it defied one of the major myths about autism that was circulating at the time, which is that autistic people don't get humor, and I thought, well, that's wrong. This is hilarious. This is one of the funniest websites I've ever seen. And so even back then, even though that was a long time ago, and a long time in my personal evolution, I started to see that the typical descriptions of autism that had been, promulgated for half a century at least were wrong. And another example of that I got when I was writing Geek Syndrome was that, Lorna Wing, who in general was a very good influence on autism history and popularized the conception of the spectrum, and is kind of one of the heroes of my book, actually. But one of the things that she did that was not so great was that she kind of spread the conception that autistic children do not do pretend play to connect with other kids. And that may or may not be true, but unfortunately, it got generalized to autistic kids have no imagination. That's what people were saying. And so certainly the media, And so I went to interview this kid who was, like a teenager, and he was building an imaginary universe on his computer with a race of people that had 3 genders, and was like completely fascinating and like so imaginative. And yet he was getting beaten up at school, and kids were like bribing him to wear stupid outfits so they could laugh at him. And I thought, my God, this kid is amazing and he has incredible imagination. And yet the clinicians are saying he has no imagination, and the bullies are just beating him up. And so it haunted me that there was this set of misconceptions that practically everyone believed at the time, at least in the mainstream NT community. And so I was bothered by that. And then Geek Syndrome came out. I thought nobody would read it because I handed it in right before 9/11. And originally it was going to be the cover story of Wired, but then 9/11 happened. And so it was like, put at the back of the magazine. I thought, well, that was that. Nobody will ever hear of that article again. For the next 10 years, I got email about it almost every week from autistic people, from the relatives of autistic people. And they were all, the emails were generally about very day-to-day needs that were not being met by society. Healthcare, employment, housing, these were the very basic bread and butter issues that anybody needs to be taken care of to have a good life. Meanwhile, autism went from this kind of obscure, interest to everybody was talking about autism, but they were saying the wrong things. They were saying like, do vaccines cause autism? And so if there was an article about, say, autistic people looking for jobs in the newspaper, you'd see the article, and then in the comments section, you'd say, autism is caused by vaccines, and then if you pushed against that, which I tried to do a little at first until I realized it was completely a waste of time, unless I did something more substantial like writing NeuroTribes. If I pushed back on it, they would say, you're a shill for big pharma, And so it's like, I wasn't a shill for big pharma. I'd written a bunch of very critical articles about big pharma for Wired, I knew big pharma was capable of terrible things, but they were not causing autism with vaccines. And so I started to think after a while, the reason why everybody is so distracted by this vaccine bollocks is that nobody can explain why the number of diagnoses started going up so sharply in the 1990s. And even if it was in a newspaper like the New York Times, which has, considerable reportorial resources, they always said, it's a baffling enigma. It's a mystery. It's a puzzle, So I thought, why is it such a bloody puzzle? Like, why can't we look and find out why the diagnoses started going up so much? And so that was why I started writing NeuroTribes.
Okay, and it's quite fascinating to me when we're talking about Silicon Valley and that original article, because where I live at the moment in Warwickshire, which is in the Midlands in the UK, there is a kind of a mini Silicon Valley. It's called the M40 corridor, and around that area there's lots of car manufacturers, there's lots of games companies, there's lots of that kind of company. And in Warwickshire, the referral rate for autism is much higher than statistical neighbours. So I do wonder whether there's that kind of effect going on. I mean, nobody. No,
I know, I do too.
Nobody's talking about it, but
well, the one person who has been talking about it actually is a person with a kind of a mixed legacy, I must say, Simon Baron-Cohen. He's been talking about that, and he's been doing research on on autism and high-tech communities for decades. I think he had already done his first study when I wrote Geek Syndrome back before 2001. But few people have followed up those studies, and it is completely fascinating Yes, someone just said mixed legacy.
Yeah, I
might be
suspect
the-
he's not a popular character
right.
here
No,
tonight.
I completely understand. In fact, I understand. I know things, but anyway, yes. I mean, yes. So I think there's much more research to be done about that. But the other thing is that it's also important to point out that by saying, "Oh, autistic people, they're so gifted in technology," like that's, it's another harmful stereotype if you think you're describing everyone. And
Of course, yeah.
yeah.
I mean,
So
there's a percentage of all neurotypes, I'm sure, that are gifted in
right,
lots of different things.
right,
We're all
exactly,
different, aren't we?
exactly, yes.
Okay, so I suspect that writing or maybe researching and writing neurotribes has changed your life.
Yes,
Would that
absolutely.
be true?
Complete
Yeah.
transformation.
So how
And
has it changed your life?
well, for one thing, I can approach this question from a lot of different angles. One angle is I have a lot of autistic friends now, which is awesome. I love my autistic friends. And in fact, how that started to happen was that I would go to, while I was researching NeuroTribes, I would go to professional conferences on autism, and oh Lord, they were terribly dreary. And I certainly understood why autistic people themselves avoided going to them, because it was one description after another of what a burden autistic people are on their families, et cetera, blah, blah, blah. And it was just bloody depressing, and I remember, this is kind of a dark story, but I remember being absolutely shocked at a conference when a woman whose name I forget actually, who was getting a Lifetime Achievement Award for her research in autism. And there were like a couple of thousand people in the room. This was at INSAR, the big international autism conference in America. She was getting a Lifetime Achievement Award, and she said kind of airily, well, back when I started, the study of autistic children was basically veterinary medicine. I was like, what? What did she just say? And there was this kind of like awkward, I hope it was awkward silence in the room, and I thought, Jesus Christ, it's like that kinds of statement would just go over with no pushback, in these conferences. And so I started to basically hang out with the autistic people at the conferences, because they generally had a sharper appreciation of what was being said about them. And they were also, challenging the notion that autism discussion was a conversation happening behind the backs of autistic people when they weren't around, And so I started just hanging out with autistic people at conferences, feeling more comfortable, because there was also less, I don't know, BS, as we say in America, just less ego, less whatever, less pretension. And the biggest influence on NeuroTribes, the way that it came out, was there's a guy in America who I wrote about in the book named Ari Ne'eman. He launched the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network when he was a teenager. And he was, he's a powerhouse. He's incredibly bright and funny and sweet and, informed guy who was basically very interested in building a bridge between the disability rights movement and the autism rights movement. And he's done a lot of that work. But early on in my research for NeuroTribes, he said, well, what you've got to do is go to Autistic, which was a series of conferences in America that was like Autiscape in Europe. I've always wanted to be able to drop into Autiscape, but I actually had to get a waiver to go to Autistic because I was an NT, And then when I got there, I felt how to put it? I felt shy, because it was like, oh my God, I'm gonna have to come out as an NT which, brought back memory. I'm gay, so it brought back memories of like, oh my God, I have to come out, in front of my class or whatever. But Autreat was an absolute revelation to me because I learned that so many of the things that I'd been told about autistic people were myths. For example, when I was researching the Geek Syndrome, I went to a local clinic here with a very, very well-known autism clinician whose name I won't mention, and it's not Simon or anything, it's an American clinician. And so we sat behind a one-way mirror as kids were evaluated. And I saw this young boy come in, and he was completely adorable. He was like full of great energy and friendly and sweet. So he comes in the room, and there was a model of the Starship Enterprise from Star Trek on the table, and he went right to it, And so I turned to the clinician. I said, "Are you saying that this young man will never have a relationship and will never have, any kind of interest in romance?" Or yes, she said very dourly, like it's very unlikely that he would ever have a relationship. Meanwhile, at Autreat, I saw two people who had met there and gotten married, and they would hang out at Autreat together, stimming together while holding each other's hands, like just rocking back and forth. I thought it was one of the most beautiful things I'd ever seen in my life. And there was another hilarious moment at Autreat when Ari had been appointed by President Obama to the National Council on Disability here. And but some horrible, probably Republican senators were holding up his nomination. And, Ari was getting, the feedback was like these horribly ableist comments like, hiring an autistic person for the National Council on Disability is like hiring a blind surgeon, just like the worst, crap. And so Ari had just gotten seated. Those Congress people had finally dropped their objections to him. And so Ari came to Autreat a day late, and he was sort of like the homecoming hero who had just, gotten this great position. And so he walks in the room, and a young woman at the back of the room said, "We love you, Ari, if we were capable of feeling such an emotion." And so, the note, I quickly learned that the, notion that autistic people lack humor or sarcasm, was just complete bollocks. And, yeah. And I could also see delightfully how autistic people used their so-called special interests or passions to connect with each other. So, one of them actually had a Star Trek episodes playing on some portable video player, and there was like a games night, or a night when everybody brought their special interests sort of together and could share them. It was very beautiful. And by the end of Autreat, which was, I think, about 4 days or so, I had just been sort of washed clean of all these myths by the living reality of autistic people when they were in their own space. It was like, up till then, every autistic person I'd ever seen, although I'd probably seen a whole lot more than that and didn't know it, but the the people who are officially autistic, who I was introduced to, I was meeting them in clinics or with psychiatrists' offices or whatever, and it was like, well, of course they were, uptight. I'm uptight when I'm in the clinic, So it was just lovely to spend so much time with autistic people. And in fact, when I came out of Autreat, the neurotypical world seemed really oppressive. It seemed like everybody it was like little Donald Trumps, like running around everywhere, bragging about their accomplishments and trying to be, kind of, I don't know, whatever. But so I remember actually coming back to this desk where I'm sitting at right now, right after Autreat, and I started to write my book. And, I'm sort of like going down the list of like, these are the 5, signs of autism or whatever. And it was like, I literally stopped myself. I had a moment when I said, Steve, shut up. Just stop repeating these things. You were just with these people for a week or so. Do not repeat these myths. And so that was really the beginning of NeuroTribes transcending the medical model, you could say, and becoming more part of what we call the social model of disability, where we look at the ways in which society is not supporting, where we look at disability as not something located in the person themselves, but located in the relationship between the person and their society and their support system. Yeah. And so someone who can be considered, if somebody who lives in a wheelchair lives in a town with no wheelchair access, no ramp, no curb cuts in the sidewalk, no publicly accessible bathrooms, they're very disabled. But if they live in a town that has all of those things, then they're less disabled. And so that was kind of the beginning of me moving from the medical model to the social model of disability.
Okay. My next question might possibly be redundant now, maybe, because it's what was the most fascinating or surprising part of the research for you?
Oh, well, there's a big moment for autism history people, I must say. And it blew my mind. And that was when I knew that I really, had something going on. And that was the moment when, like, if you look at textbooks and websites, even still, they would often say, autism was discovered nearly simultaneously by Leo Kanner in America and Hans Asperger in Austria, in one of the great coincidences of 20th century medicine. Like that idea had gone unchallenged forever, since the 1940s. And there was a moment when I figured out that, in fact, what had happened was much more interesting. That Hans Asperger and his Jewish colleagues, and I'm putting an emphasis on that, George Frankl and Annie Weiss, they worked together in Vienna until the Nazis took over. Then Frankl and Weiss both had to flee Austria because, for obvious reasons, to not be murdered in the Holocaust. And it turned out that the person who helped rescue them was Leo Kanner. And that when Leo Kanner saw his first autistic patient, he did not know what to make of him. And he wrote in his notes, in fact, schizophrenia. And that was Leo Kanner's, in fact, unchanging idea, was that autistic people had schizophrenia, and that when they were kids, they would be diagnosed as autistic, and when they were adults, they would be diagnosed as schizophrenic, which turns out to be completely wrong. But that it was George Frankl and Annie Weiss who helped Kanner diagnose his first autistic patient. And that's because they knew what not just autism, but the whole spectrum looked like, because that's what they had been working with Hans Asperger on in Vienna. And so the spectrum idea really came from them, actually. And it was coming across Hans Asperger's paper, which had not been translated into English yet, or barely had. Actually, it had not been. That inspired Lorna Wing to come up with the idea of the spectrum. And back in Asperger's clinic in Vienna, they had called it the autistic continuum. And so it was a much more interesting story than, oh, what a coincidence. These two guys both wrote about autism within a couple of years of each other. No, it was actually that Kanner had inherited, in a sense, Asperger's Jewish colleagues, and then, but he could not find jobs for them at Johns Hopkins, where he was working. So they sort of moved on to other parts of their lives. But when I remember the moment when I figured out that the George Frankl that Leo Kanner mentioned on one paper and the George Frankl that Hans Asperger had been mentioning was the same guy, I was like, it can't be the same guy. And in fact, there was another George Frankl who was like a famous psychiatrist. And so I thought, oh, it's probably that guy or whatever, you know. But then I remember looking down the CV, of the, you know, the academic record of George Frankl. And so it's like, you know, Leo Kanner, Harriet Lane Home, blah, blah, blah. And then, you know, University of Vienna. And I'm like, oh my God, it's the same guy. And I was the first person in 50 years to figure that, you know, I was the first person ever actually to figure that out. And that blew my mind.
I can see that would blow your mind.
Yes.
Did you celebrate?
No, but well, I celebrated in my head, you know, because I thought, wow, I've really got, you know, this is something here. And I knew that, you know, I didn't have the illusion that it was like, it's going to be a bestseller. I never thought NeuroTribes would be a bestseller. The fact that NeuroTribes was a bestseller came as a complete shock to me, actually. The entire time I was writing it, and I cannot understate this, actually, the entire time I was writing it, I thought I was committing career suicide. I was feared because I knew it was not like any other autism book that had ever been written. And I did not know if that was good or bad. You know, I thought maybe it was bad, you know, and plus I was pushing against a million other books, you know, that were saying, well, it was a simultaneous discovery by Asperger and Connor, you know. And so I remember, I can tell you actually, the first person to respond to it in a way that made me think, maybe I've been worrying about this for 5 years for nothing. Which was, do you guys know who Oliver Sacks was? Yeah. So Oliver Sacks had a lifelong, or I don't know about lifelong, but many decade assistant and editor named Kate Edgar. And Oliver ended up writing the introduction to NeuroTribes. And right before he died, actually, I was very grateful to him. But so one of the first people I sent the manuscript to was Kate Edgar. And I was, you know, afraid, you know, Oliver had written a lot about autism. He'd written Anthropologist on Mars, about Temple Grandin. You know, so I thought, well, she knows her stuff, you know. So I sent it to her. And then I woke up the next morning, turned my phone back on, and there were all these, I don't think I've ever told this story in public before, but anyway, there were all these text messages from her. She had been reading the book all night long and crying. And so I thought, oh my God, she read the book all night long? Like, maybe that's good, you know? So that was the first moment that I thought, maybe I hadn't completely ruined my life by writing this book.
Yeah, I don't think you ruined your life. No.
No, in a way, it was, yeah, when it was kind of a certain phase of my life began when the book came out. Yeah.
Yes. And if somebody was reading it for the first time now, what would you like them to take away from it?
Well, boy, I can answer that question at any number of levels. Like, you know, there's certain, you know, obviously I try to make a strong argument for developing more humane policies so that autistic people have access to education, housing, healthcare, those basic human needs. I hope that I've also changed, well, let me put it this way. For most of the 20th century, there was this almost weird belief that there was one kind of mind that was better than all the other kinds, you know, that there was one normal way of being, that neurotypicality was the apex of human evolution, you know, or something like that. And that was how the psychiatric establishment behaved for, you know, most of the 20th century. And if you were gay, you could end up in an asylum, you know, getting electric shocks. If you're autistic, you can end up in an asylum getting electric shocks, you know. And so it wasn't just, oh, we're not quite respecting these weird eccentrics enough. It was more like the effect of having that notion that there was one kind of mind that was, the only kind of mind that was good, literally ruined people's lives. And so generations of autistic people, lived very unsatisfying lives in institutions. And there was another moment in the research when I came across the fact that Leo Kanner had described autism as quote unquote childhood schizophrenia. And I figured out at some point that a mental hospital just a few blocks up the hill from where I am now, there were hundreds of patients with childhood schizophrenia there in the 70s. And in fact, people were talking about an epidemic of childhood schizophrenia in the 70s. And I thought, it's the same people. I got a hold of a bunch of records from that hospital, and they were describing, oh, this kid, is fascinated by ham radios, or this kid, will only eat spaghetti every night, or whatever. It's like, these people sound autistic to me, at every level, really. And so basically what I'm hoping my book did was open more minds to the notion that the ideal world is not a world in which everybody's mind is the same, but in which everybody's mind is different, but everyone is given the best chance of success.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, things are changing, aren't they? What do you think has changed since the publication of NeuroTribes in terms of acceptance, understanding?
I'm gonna actually I'm going to read a statement about this because it's good news, and Lord knows we need good news. I mean, the two things that I did not predict, when I was writing NeuroTribes, you can imagine how it has been for me, who spent years writing about how the Nazis took over Germany and Austria, and how so-called normal Germans, were willing to look the other way when there was smoke rising out of the crematoria and stuff like that. You can imagine what it's been like for me to watch the expansion of Trumpism and just right-wing extremism. I mean, now we literally have, thugs attacking gay bars, or attacking librarians. So that has been chilling to see that. And of course, COVID has been awful as well. But there's a lot of good news since NeuroTribes was published, really because of the work that the autistic community has done. And so I just want to read this little statement. In the years since NeuroTribes was published in 2015, many significant advances have been made in autistic representation in media, in popular culture, and even in the halls of power where decisions are made that directly affect the lives of millions of people with learning differences. Okay, I'm not going to read this because that's too boring, but I will say that here are a few good things that have happened. Pixar made a short called Loop, which is about a non-speaking young Black woman. The voice actor for her character is autistic. It does not whitewash autism at all. It grapples with the difficulties of opening avenues of communication for someone who does not have them. It's a beautiful, beautiful film. And I thought it was wonderful that they used an autistic voice actor. Another great film in recent years is The Reason I Jump by Jerry Rothman, based on the bestseller by the Japanese teenager who just joined Twitter the other day. I was kind of fascinated to see. But Naoki Hokashida, I think, I may be mispronouncing that. But the movie actually goes far beyond the book, because the book was basically about him. It was like his diary. But the movie is a cross-cultural look at what happens to autistic people in many different cultures, including cultures where they're considered to be possessed by the devil, and so it looks at the situation of autistic people in many different cultural contexts, and thus makes a very strong argument for the social model of disability. Another awesome film that hardly anybody's heard of, unfortunately, just came out last year, a documentary called This Is Not About Me, which tells the true story of a young woman named Jordan Zimmerman, who was completely written off by her teachers as having no future at all because of her difficult behavior. And, people would, some people, my critics or whatever, would say to me like, well, what about autistic kids who self-harm and, can't even talk? She was that person. She was very angry, very self-injurious, prone to meltdowns, obviously very frustrated, until she got an iPad and AAC that she could do so she could communicate. And she just got a master's degree in special education. So instead of, her parents were literally told, like, your daughter's going to an institution for the rest of her life. Instead, she's going to be teaching other teachers how to work with kids with intellectual disabilities. So that is wonderful. And then also, autistic voices have become much more prominent in, social media. So when Sia's movie Music came out, there was a lot of criticism about the central character. She depicted the use of restraint and seclusion in objectionable ways. 10 years ago, what would have happened was nothing, neurotypical journalists would have said, oh, how sweet. A rock star is, making a movie about these pathetic autistic people, Instead, we had autistic people leading the conversation about the stereotypes that Sia had promulgated. And Sia, her first instinct, unfortunately, was to reject those comments. It's like, no, I'm sorry. All right. And they did not give up. And she eventually apologized, re-edited the film, blah, blah, blah. So autistic voices have become much more prominent. And that's also true in books. In fact, let me give a plug to a fantastic book that's not written by me. This book, We're Not Broken, by Eric M. Garcia. Eric is fantastic. He's been a reporter for the Washington Post and many other, The Hill. He worked. He's a DC journalist. He's autistic, and he's also a very incredibly sweet guy. And we met randomly. He loves this. We met randomly on a train, which is one of his special interests. I think I was talking on the phone, which I don't usually like to do on trains. I'm usually a quiet car kind of person, but I was talking on the phone, and this guy a couple seats ahead of me turns around and says, "Are you Steve Silberman?" And I was like, "Yes, I am," And so we started talking. That was Eric Garcia. And We're Not Broken, subtitled Changing the Autism Conversation, is the kind of book that I could only have dreamed about when I was writing NeuroTribes, because it's a history of autism and the journey that autistic people have taken towards autonomy through autistic eyes. So that's another great bit of progress. And Eric pointed out to me that in the 2020 Democratic presidential primary, candidates like Pete Buttigieg, Bernie Sanders, Julian Castro, and Elizabeth Warren all released comprehensive disability policy plans while actively consulting autistic people, not just their parents. And autistic people are also running for office themselves, which is great. And now we're also starting to look at how underdiagnosed groups like women and people of color have been in autism. We're also looking at, there does seem to be some interesting correlation between autism and LGBTQ identities. I know a tremendous number autistic women who identify as gay. A bunch of my friends, autistic friends, have come out as trans, including one. There's one character in my book who I'm not gonna out, but at least one character in my book has gone through transition, and I think that is all wonderful. And now what we mainly need to do is to prevent the Republicans from doing everything from taking away my right to get married. I'm a gay married guy, and that's an important point too that I want to make quickly, is that sometimes I'll talk to young autistic people and they'll be like, oh my God, everything is so depressing, like it takes so long to make social change. That's definitely true, and yes, everything is really depressing right now in a lot of ways, but I have a ring on my finger instead of handcuffs in an asylum. When I was in high school, there's this diagnostic manual called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM. And when I was in high school, homosexuality was in that book. I was considered mentally diseased, because I would get crushes on my friends. And now I'm legally married, and hopefully even with the completely corrupted Supreme Court that we have here now, hopefully I'll get to stay married. But that was a huge social change that happened in my lifetime.
Yeah, I mean, I often say to people who, feel a bit depressed. I mean, the cohort for Autistic Girls Network, kind of membership of the Facebook group, does tend to be parents of who obviously many of them are autistic themselves, of girls who haven't been diagnosed until their teens and consequently have gone into some kind of crisis because they haven't been supported.
Absolutely.
And so that's, that is a difficult time. But, I say, look at how far we've come in 10 years. Look at how different everything is from 10 years ago. There has been progress made, and we need to build on that.
Absolutely. And, I remember being shocked when I discovered in the course of writing or researching NeuroTribes that one of the leading autism clinicians in the country, a guy named Kevin Palfrey at Yale Child Study Center, missed autism in his own daughter until she was a teenager, even though he evaluated kids for autism all day. And he did that because so many of the diagnostic filters sort of were based on stereotypes that were just not, that were male. They were based on male stereotypes. And so some of the most fascinating discussions I've had lately were with autistic women, including in England. I had a wonderful conversation the last time I was in London with a group called Aut Angel. Do you know those people?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was an absolutely wonderful afternoon. And one older autistic woman who was diagnosed in midlife said to me, it was actually at the very first reading for NeuroTribes, and I was so psyched when a bunch of autistic people showed up for that reading, because I really wanted it to be safe space for autistic people, And so this woman who was there, a friend of mine, Rena Kaur, said, getting a diagnosis in midlife was like finding the Rosetta Stone to myself. I have never forgotten those words.
Yeah, we had somebody join the group a few weeks ago, the Facebook group a few weeks ago, and we asked questions. People have to answer questions before they're let in the group, and she said that she wanted to join because her granddaughter was autistic, and also that she had just been diagnosed autistic, and she was 82.
Oh, that's amazing.
So, yeah,
that's awesome. We have like 9 minutes left. I'm a little worried that people will not get the chance to.
Yeah, I'm going to stop. My next question is too depressing anyway. I'm not going to ask it. Okay. Let me just check to see whether there's any question that we absolutely must have. I don't think so. Okay. Oh no, actually there is one I want to ask. Just one, and then we'll switch. So
Sure.
everyone else, think if you have like a burning question to ask, then put it in the
Okay.
chat, but we might not have time to get to it. But I did want to ask, how would you write the book in terms of autistic girls and women, or those brought up so, if you were writing it today?
Well, that's a really complex question. One of the things that I wish I had known when I was working on NeuroTribes was that it takes a long time to write a book. Like when I first, got an agreement from the publisher, they thought I would write it in about 1.5 years. And they also thought it would be about 200 pages. Well, when I turned it in, it was 800 pages. And it had taken me 5 years. And so the whole time I was writing NeuroTribes, I was sort of frantically, I felt like the sword of Damocles was, just hovering over my head the whole time. So I had to, write it, as quickly as possible. But I knew that I was covering this incredibly important history. I wish I'd had 10 years to write it. And if I had had 10 years to write it, one of the things I would have done is gone back and specifically looked for more cases of autism among chronically underdiagnosed groups, like people of color and women. And I mentioned that, they thought it was going to be 200 pages. I handed it in at 800 pages. They had to cut it back to 550 pages in just a couple of weeks, actually. All that cutting happened. And most of the cutting came from Modern Times, because they thought they basically thought that the stuff about, World War II and the Holocaust and all that was so groundbreaking that, they didn't want to cut any of that. But that had a funny, completely, not funny, but tragic, you could say, unintended effect, which is that groups that were chronically underdiagnosed until Modern Times then got less represented in the book. So I ended up using a couple of parts of the book that got cut in an article for an online science magazine called Undark, called The Invisibility of Black Autism. So if you can search on that phrase, the invisibility of Black autism. And I wish I could have included more women in the book, but the cases I was able to locate, women have been chronically underdiagnosed since Asperger. So yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so B does have a burning question, she says, and actually it's similar to one of the questions that I had, so I know that you've seen it and you're prepared to answer it. B says, I have a burning question. As a fellow queer Jewish American living in London, I'm super grateful for your work or book. I'm wondering about your feelings on ABA, as it seems to be the default treatment, in inverted commas, in America. Has links to conversion therapy, etc., and isn't common practice in the UK, as it's considered to be inhumane, although we do have PBS in the UK, and indeed ABA in the UK, and some of our large charities also are using it in their homes and schools.
Yes, and in fact, there's an absolutely landmark article that just came out the other day in Stat News. If you go to my Twitter, which is at Steve Silberman with a B, I've been tweeting it like mad. And in fact, there are 2 articles about the ABA industry and how they've become an arm of the private equity industry. And so private equity companies, they're not there because they're nice. They're there because they want to make money. So they've turned ABA into like this cash cow. And as you all know, even better than I do, ABA is recalled with trauma by many autistic people who've been through it. I am perhaps a little less radical about ABA than some people, in that I have met some ABA therapists who are, look to build autonomy in their clients, etc. But it's definitely true that ABA has horrible roots in behaviorism, which I expose in NeuroTribes at great length. Everything from, the original ABA was like use cattle prods and loud noises, and it's horrific, absolutely horrific, grotesque. Also, ABA was used to, everybody just thinks ABA is about autism. It was also used to train gay kids or trans kids to be straight in an equally brutal fashion. The sort of the kid who was used as the example of successful ABA for decades by one of Ivar Lovas's colleagues, George Riekers, committed suicide. So how successful is that? So ABA has a very dark history, but what it has in America is it has an industry that's like the mafia. It's like they insist that ABA is the only intervention in town, that if they reiterate the old stereotypes that if a kid doesn't get ABA before the developmental window closes, which itself turns out to be a myth. And in fact, autistic people are able to not just change their lives, but change their brains and grow and develop in social abilities throughout their lives. That's been told to me by people like Temple Grandin and people like John Elder Robeson, author of Look Me in the Eye, that it wasn't until they kind of entered the public sphere as writers and that they learned how to be more comfortable with themselves and with other people. And so the notion that there's some narrow window, the ABA industry terrifies parents with that idea. And there are other forms of intervention that are more humane. There's something called floor time. Oh boy, I'm forgetting the name of the book. What is it? Oh God, let me just, sorry, I am getting old. Let me just look at something.
Aren't we all?
Yeah, we are. Hold on for a moment. Okay. Oh yes, Barry Presents Uniquely Human. When people say to me, well, all that geek stuff is nice, but what about my kid who has really difficult behavior? Uniquely Human is a wonderful non-ABA way of looking at behavior and looking at it as a response to as a sensible difficult behavior, as a sensible response to a completely well, someone just said Barry Presents supports ABA. If I were you, I would talk to him about that, and supports ABA and Temple Grandin. Well, I very much object to several things that Temple has said, but I generally see her as someone very important in the history of autism because she was the first autistic adult to come out. So I have a little more respect for her than some people seem to have. But I know that she's also said terrible things and, even was anti-vaccine at some point, I think. Yeah, I get it. Bobby Ullman says, she's important in the history, but we have moved on. Well, I'm a historian, so I tried to give her, her proper place in history. But yes, I understand that the autism rights movement has moved on as it should. Yeah, so anything else?
Okay. And, we did have a question. I know in the questions that I sent to you, we did have a question comparing the autism civil rights movement with other civil rights movements. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to say about that in the next minute or two. Or
Yeah, sure. I think, as I mentioned earlier, Ari Ne'eman was instrumental in reframing autism within the context of the disability rights movement. And I remember when I started researching NeuroTribes, there was this thing called Aspie supremacy, if anybody remembers that, where there were a bunch of people online saying like, actually, we're more evolved than, yeah, that's okay. But a lot of my autistic friends struggle day to day with lots of things. And I think that just saying like, well, actually, they're more evolved, it doesn't answer all the questions. Autism, I think, is a disability. People are more disabled by it if they're in a situation where they have not enough support, where people don't know who they are, where people are comparing them to neurotypicals, where they're being bullied. But I do think that it's really important that the autism rights movement build common cause with the disability rights movement. And that's where the word neurodiversity came from. It came from Judy Singer, a graduate student in Australia, being mentored by a guy who had survived polio, which is now back because of the anti-vaxxers, by the way. And he lived in a wheelchair, and he pointed out to her that his ability to get around in a wheelchair was completely dependent on societal accommodations. And that was where she got the idea for neurodiversity. So the original impetus for the neurodiversity concept came from disability rights movement. And I think that that's a really important bridge that has been built by autistic people in the last few years.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, I'm going to leave it there because we are over the 8 o'clock that I promised you. And, we always need to keep our promises. So thank you so much for giving up your time and for all of the trouble that we had rescheduling this.
Well, we both have been through a lot.
Yeah. My whole family had COVID, and then
yeah, my mom just got COVID the other day. Actually,
yes, and I hope she's okay.
Yeah,
I did give you the inspiring tale of my grandmother-in-law, though.
You did. That
99
really
with
did
COVID.
help. Thank you. Well, thank you very much to everyone for coming. I really, really appreciate it. And I cannot wait to get back to the UK. So hopefully I'll get to meet all you guys at some point.
Yeah, and we're getting rid of we're getting rid of one of our right-wing prime ministers. Who knows who we'll get next? But
I'm glad I don't have to look at that hair anymore.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks, Steve. And thanks everybody for coming. Night or good morning or
Thank you so much.